A decent portion of the videos on this channel are reviewing cards. Either the reviewing cards that are just coming out or the reviewing cards that came out in the past, and we're kind of talking about why they were successful or why they weren't successful. And I get questions all the time from people asking, well, how do you actually review these cards? What criteria are you looking at? And in today's video, I wanted to go through the 4 criteria. It's sort of 4 steps. You go from 1 all the way to 4, and you really just, as you're going through them, you're seeing how much better a card can be compared to other cards, and I think they're really helpful. Maybe true competitive players won't find this video as useful because they have their own ways of sort of seeing if a card is actually good or not, but if you're someone that's a casual player or getting into competitive play or even an intermediate player, I think that these can be some useful and helpful tips for actually looking at cards, picking them over others, and then playing them in your decks to take to tournaments. Anyway though, so like I said, there's 4 categories, and I think that it's more like levels. That's a more accurate term. So 4 levels of card review, and the first level, the one that pretty much everyone does, even the people that don't play this game very often do, and that is looking at the card itself. And I think that this is, like I said, the biggest one that people do, and also I think it's where a lot of casual players stop. Maybe they go to the second level here, but I think for the most part, when I'm making videos about cards like Chaos Max Dragon, they're only looking at the card itself. And oftentimes this goes one step further, and not only are they looking at the card itself, they're actually only thinking about when the card is on the field. So that's kind of the case of Chaos Max Dragon. When people read the card and say, well, how is this bad? And it's not that the card itself is bad, it certainly meets the criteria for this first level of card analysis. It's just that it doesn't quite live up to the expectations as far as these other levels go to. So when we're thinking of sort of the surface level analysis of level 1, it's only looking at the card in a vacuum compared to no other cards, and oftentimes is only looking at it when it's already on the field, sort of ignoring the other aspects of it. So that moves us to number 2, level 2 here, and we have looking at the way the card is summoned or activated, stuff like that. And this is where the cards like Chaos Max, cards like the Egyptian Gods sort of fall off, because it's true that cards like the Egyptian Gods, if you always just could start with them on your board, of course you would. The problem with cards like that is that they're difficult to summon, and that really makes a big deal because cards aren't played in a vacuum. They're played with all sorts of cards against all sorts of strategies, so it really does matter how hard it is to summon them, or in the case of spells and traps, how hard it is to activate them. So when you're looking at a card, you don't want to just look at how it is when it's already on the field. You really want to be paying attention to how hard is it to summon, how hard is it to activate, and once you've done those things, if a card meets both those criteria, then you move on to number 3, which is looking at what deck you could play it in, or more specifically, looking at what the other 37 cards you're going to play with that card. I've mentioned in a couple videos now, I think the one that comes to mind is Fair Yu-Gi-Oh! Decks Don't Win, is that there's plenty of decks out there that aren't very good, but have one really, really powerful card. So when we're looking at this third aspect, this third level of card analysis, we're thinking about those types of cards where maybe the card itself is really powerful, maybe the card itself is even broken, but if you can't fully flesh out a deck around that card, well, it doesn't really matter because you won't always have that card. An example of this that I think about is Amazoness Princess. So it meets criteria 1, it's a pretty good card by itself. It meets criteria 2, super easy to summon and activate, and you can even activate it repeatedly. And then we look at number 3, and the biggest problem with Amazoness Princess in the TCG is that the rest of the deck that you can play it in is kind of hard. I mean, if we think of my Amazoness deck, I couldn't even play a pure Amazoness deck because there aren't enough Amazoness cards to actually make up a 40 card competitive strategy, so I had to play cards like the Phantom Knights, and even then there aren't quite enough good cards for that deck to even be a rogue contender. So you've got your card, you've got your Amazoness Princess, and you've looked at 1, 2, and 3, and you even look at 3 and say, you know what, maybe the Amazoness deck that I built isn't actually that bad, which in your opinion means that it meets all 3 of the criteria that we've talked about. What's that last criteria? Well, the last one is sort of the back-breaking one for many cards and strategies out there, and that's looking at how powerful, how consistent, how versatile the deck is against the current metagame. And this is where a lot of cards and decks just kind of fall off, and it's not really necessarily their fault, but this is something that changes from week to week, from month to month, that kind of stuff. The metagame is always evolving, even from week to week, especially if there's like a regional qualifier sort of bundle one weekend where one deck's really popular, maybe the next weekend a different deck, maybe the second best deck now is the best deck that everyone's playing. So the metagame is always shifting, and occasionally you can find a card that almost meets all of these criteria but doesn't quite meet number 4, and then you just kind of think about that card, keep it in the back of your mind, and then when that card eventually does meet the 4th criteria, maybe suddenly you can play it in a strategy that you're already playing, or you can make an entire deck around it. An example of a card that sometimes meets number 4 and always meets number 1, 2, and 3 is Magic Deflector. The card itself is extremely powerful, locking down a ton of different types of cards. It's really easy to activate. Yes, it is a trap, so it's a little slower, but you can always just flip it. It has no activation requirement. You can even activate it preemptively if you want to, and you can pretty much play it in any deck. So it meets 1, 2, and 3. However, the card isn't always played because sometimes it's not a powerful metagame counter, but it has been a powerful metagame counter multiple times. I think it was really good against Monarchs. That was sort of the first time a lot of people started playing it, but it was also extremely effective against Zodiac True Dracos, locking down all the True Draco cards and Dragonic Diagram and Zodiac Barrage and Twin Twisters for that matter. So pretty much just shut down that deck entirely, and we saw veterans of the game like Patrick Hoban playing 3 copies of Magic Deflector in his topping list from the WCQ in 2017, specifically for Zodiac True Dracos. Now that we know the 4 levels, and I've already talked about a couple cards like Chaos Max Dragon, like the Egyptian Gods, like Amazoness Princess, like Magic Deflector, I want to talk about a card that actually sometimes meets some of these criteria, but doesn't necessarily do them in order. And I want to talk about Magic Cylinder. Yes, the card that I've made fun of a lot. So if we go through these 4 levels of card analysis, you'll notice that Magic Cylinder actually does meet number 1. I think on paper, the card isn't that bad. It certainly isn't amazing, but it's not really terrible. It's when you get to number 2 where you realize, okay, the problem with the card is that it has a really difficult activation requirement for not enough of a payoff. And then you go to 3, and here's where it gets interesting. Pretty much any single deck can play Magic Cylinder. So you might notice now that not everything always meets like 1, 2, and then doesn't meet 3 and 4. Sometimes it meets one of them and then doesn't meet the next one, but then goes back to meeting them. But then once again, at number 4, for the most part, Magic Cylinder isn't very powerful against the metagame, but it's a not terrible card by itself, and also you can play it in a lot of strategies. So I think what I'm trying to show you guys here is that even though Magic Cylinder does meet 2 of the criteria, we're really looking to play cards, or as many cards as possible in our decks, that meet all 4 of the criteria. And I do want to mention, just as a little side note here, the side deck cards are sort of different. And what I mean by that is that side deck cards usually don't have to be as good against the entire metagame. If we're thinking of that 4th point, oftentimes side deck cards are played for specific matchups, so they have I mean, you can't draw a side deck card in games 1, 2, and 3 unless you actually put the card into your deck. You have to choose to do that. So cards like Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries, they might not always be good against every single deck in the metagame. However, they are really good against decks like Goki and Spirals and ABC, so you might want to just keep copies in your side deck for sort of deciding when to put those in and when to not put them in. However, when the metagame becomes so stagnant, when we know that you're going to play against Goki like 6 out of 8 rounds, as happened like a couple months ago, then maybe it actually does meet the 4th criteria even in the main deck, so you might actually find yourself playing Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries in your main deck, which is pretty crazy to think about. Anyway, that is going to pretty much end today's video. Hopefully this 4-point system actually does help you guys. It's something that I'm always thinking about when I'm reviewing cards, although it's something I've never explicitly actually talked about in a video. But I really do think if you're someone that's trying to build decks from scratch or figure out if certain cards are better than others, by using these 4 points, you can better do that. And I do want to mention, like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I think many competitive players sort of have their own way of doing this. Maybe they don't even really think that they're doing this. They're more just thinking of that last point, which is how powerful is this this card against the metagame, but I do think it's important to start from the very beginning and ask yourself, how easy is this to activate? How good is this by itself? Those types of questions, and then finally get to the question of how good is this compared to the rest of the meta, because that last one can change from week to week, which is really important to keep in mind. Anyway though, hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know if you have any questions, comments, or concerns. I think it's really important to talk about how I review cards so you guys can know for future videos what sort of criteria I'm looking at. I will see you guys later though. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.